This is ABC Fora.
Now, we've gathered here today to apply an intellectual blowtorch to the belly of one of the most cherished ideas of Western civilisation when we debate the motion that democracy is not for everyone. Apart from the audience of around 850 people here, we have a fantastic panel of national and international speakers. Speaking for the motion, we have Professor Carmen Lawrence. Professor Lawrence was the first Premier of a state, female Premier of a state in Australia, a former Cabinet Minister in the Federal Government, and is now Professor at the University of Western Australia. Ambassador M.K. Badrakumar is a columnist and a retired senior diplomat from India. He served formerly in Bangladesh, Pakistan and in the territories of the Soviet Union. And Professor Greg Craven is the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University and is one of the leading constitutional lawyers in Australia. Speaking against the motion, Professor John Keane from the University of Westminster in London and the author of a seminal text, The Life and Death of Democracy. Amina Razul comes from Mindanao in the Philippines. She's a former Cabinet Minister in the Philippines and is a Director of the Philippines Council for Islam and Democracy. And Dr Michael Wesley, the Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy here in Sydney. Welcome them. Now, the format for the debate is that the speakers will make their presentation. After that, I will be revealing to you the pre-debate poll results, and then we'll be opening it up to the floor. And as was being said, we'll be providing an opportunity for you, this is probably the most interactive session of the whole festival, to actually have your say. There are 4 microphones positioned around the room where you'll be asked to do that, to ask questions or to make comments. And then we'll be having the final and conclusive vote for the day to decide the result of the motion. But now to move to the debate. I'd now ask Professor Carmen Lawrence, former Premier of Western Australia, to speak for the motion that democracy is not for everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. This afternoon, I do want to argue that democracy is not for everyone, but I hasten to add, it should be. I want to speak to the evidence about democracy and how it functions, what's actually happening. Mine is a pragmatic assessment, not an idealised fantasy, not the stuff of soaring rhetoric, not Obama, but the hard-to-swallow stuff of reality, not the fairy stories that we tell ourselves, but the unforgiving evidence of falling short. In many ways, of course, it's a common human story. We're not perfect. But as long as we kid ourselves, we're unlikely to do anything about it, to improve our democracy. Democracy here and elsewhere is clearly not for everyone. Some have access to power and influence, others do not. Indeed, I think it's fair to say the majority do not. Some, in other words, are more equal than others. Animal Farm Revisited. In part, this is a design fault. Voting once every few years for 1 or 2 parties is pretty minimal. But it's been exacerbated by the pervasive influence of moneyed interests underlined through paid lobbyists, campaign donations, through the relentless campaigning of media barons on particular issues like climate change, and of course the collapse of our political parties. In reality, the great bulk of the population is excluded from the exercise of power. Ours, and indeed most democracies, are very indirect forms of democracy, one in which the work of governing is left to the few. The people, with the exception of a few privileged insiders, are kept at arm's length from the actual work of government. When was the last time you decided a policy? The very evolution of democracies, in fact, was accompanied by a powerful distrust of the people, especially the poor, the poorly educated and women. Madison, one of the founding fathers of the US democracy, argued that citizens couldn't be trusted to identify the aggregate interests of the community, a task which should be left to their elected representatives who would do it all for us. As a result, most democracies are thin democracies. Citizens are relatively passive, and experts and elites do the actual work of government. As Rousseau acerbically observed, speaking of the UK, the English people believes itself to be free. It is gravely mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of Parliament. I don't even think that's true. As soon as the members are elected, the people is enslaved. It is nothing. This is government by an elected aristocracy, mediated by the political parties, or at least that once was the case before they became political corporations, almost entirely under the control of a few machine men and these days women. Historically, those with power have had to have it wrested from their hands, inch by inch. The property franchise was abolished, women got the vote, but stood at the margins of power for another 100 years. And if you turn your backs for a minute, those who control the reins of power take it back. And in my view, they have taken it back. We're happy, it seems, to recommend the export of democracy as the ne plus ultra of governance. Bush even thought he could spread it through the barrel of a gun to Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. And we seldom ask what it is we're actually advocating. What exactly is this democracy? What are its key values and characteristics? How do we judge the success of democracies, and how do we measure up? The minimum requirements, of course, of any democracy worthy of the name are that government should be elected, not stolen, as they were in Iran, Afghanistan, and in recent history in the US. All adults should have an equal right to vote, and all votes should be of equal value. And most would include, of course, protection of civil liberties, the protection of human rights. The democratic audit of Australia includes the quality of public debate, such as we're having here today, assessing the degree to which debate and discussion can be distorted by manipulation, strategising, deception and restrictions on allowable communication. Not to mention what many regard as the core of democracy, the extent to which all citizens actively participate in the political life of the country. This, of course, requires respect for diverse views, open deliberation about decisions. If you think about that for a few minutes, you can see my problem. Our democracy doesn't measure up. It's characterised, in my view, by unsightly and factionalised squabbling, by self-interested, short-sighted people and groups. A lot of policies are the result of special pleading from those best placed to adroitly pressure and manipulate the system. Just watch the coal industry positioning on emissions trading all around the world. Yes, we do have more or less equal rights to vote and votes of equal value, but it can't be said that all citizens are equally able to influence their representatives. Business, I think, has acquired veto power in economic policy, and this establishes a vicious cycle. Belief that the ordinary views are ignored, while preference is given to big business and to political cronies. Notice what a lot of politicians do when they leave politics. I don't need to remind the Sydney audience of the influence of campaign donations. Seen a bit of that around lately. Big donations do buy privileged access to MPs and ministers. In proportion, I think, to the amount of money donated. A chook raffle certainly won't do it. Ours is a donocracy, in which the number of shares you've purchased in the party of your choice determines your effective voting power. Lobbying by the well-heeled vested interests also skews the policy agenda in favour of what someone called the financially articulate. The champagnes and canapes, the slick gleaming presentations, the smooth and not so smooth lobbying, sometimes just arm-twisting and corruption come closer to the mark, of the major corporations overwhelm the earnest pleading of small community groups and the disadvantaged. And there's no proper public record of this influence either. There is no level playing field, no equality of influence. And I don't think now any of the major players actually bother to seriously suggest that it is. Political parties, of course, once provided the avenue for people to influence their representatives in a principled way. They provided space for discussion, they settled policies before elections, they're a source of candidates, and of course a link between the wider community and MPs. Now political parties are largely vehicles for the career paths of a few paid officials. The voice is largely ignored in any case. It's largely ceremonial, and the factional games show the interests of a few insiders. And as a result, numbers in the political parties generally have plummeted. Parliament itself, of course, is largely in control of the executive. It's dominated by a disciplined bipolar system in the case of Australia. In my view, it's a theatre of meaningless ritual and confected biff. Media coverage is driven by the trivia of the day-to-day contest. And what we're seeing increasingly is a current system which is a rubber stamp model of government. The electors elect a party or leaders to govern. The government governs with total power to change the law and virtually do what it likes between elections. It doesn't help that the person who exercises the balance of power at the moment thinks that the earth is flat. We need to take back power, in my view. It's time we looked at these problems. Democracy should be for everyone, but it isn't. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Lawrence. Now, speaking against the motion, Professor John Keane, author of The Life and Death of Democracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's danger in the air, so I'm going to argue against our distinguished, deluded opponents using shock tactics. Just around the corner from where I live in London, there is a pub called the Lord Palmerston. You may recall that he was a reactionary Home Secretary in the 19th century, famous for his bitchy remarks about democracy. And in a well-known, difficult conversation with a man named John Russell, who was the architect of the 1832 Reform Act, which was a tipping point in the struggle for democracy both in Britain and in its Australian colonies, pompous Lord Palmerston told Russell that history shows, and I quote, that power in the hands of the masses throws the scum of the community to the surface. Well, dear scum, good day. Offspring community of the 19th century struggle for democracy, here we are down under, gathered to discuss the merits of the most dangerous, whatever Germaine Greer or Reverend Hitchens has had to say, the most dangerous human idea ever invented, democracy. Palmerston's insult should remind us, sit back, don't relax, here comes the first shock, that until very recently, a wet, dreary Sunday afternoon gathering dominated by well-heeled, middle-class people would typically have bad-mouthed democracy, condemned it as a formula for bad government and social disorder. So thank you to the organisers for keeping the tradition going. Thanks for the vital reminder that roughly until roughly 1945, democracy, meaning the self-government of people, was a dirty word, a rotten ideal whose dogged defenders were thought deserving of transportation to the colonies, a spell behind bars, or a good flogging and hanging. Nowadays, of course, it's avowed Democrats, as Carmen Lawrence has pointed out, who sometimes do the violence, as in Iraq, often in the name of democracy, which rather raises the question that draws us together. Is democracy a universal idea, good for everybody in all times and places? Or is it, as Nietzsche said in the 19th century, a big bogus Christian metaphor? Or, in the 1930s, as the Baltimore satirist H.L. Mencken said sarcastically, government by orgasm. What a splendid idea, government by orgasm. He meant by that democracy, a grand ideal used by some to seduce the pants of others, to get them into bed with promises of satisfaction, convince them that it's good for all people and all places, only to disappoint them with its poor performance, its miserable impotence, its failure to satisfy, and worst of all, its bare-bottomed hypocrisy. Second shock. All previous arguments in favour of democracy to win over its sceptics and outright opponents are today exhausted. My grandmother in South Australia would have said they've had the biscuit. What she meant, or what I mean, is that we've inherited in the 21st century utterly dubious justifications of democracy. that have become actually implausible or downright embarrassing. Let me list a few very quickly before I'm guillotined. The Athenian Democrats thought that demokratia was good, by far the best system of government, because it made the Athenian people and its polity a conquering empire. Once upon a time, in the age of representative democracy, its second historical phase, professed Democrats liked to say either that they had God on their side — that was the way many Protestants spoke in the 19th century anti-slavery movement, for instance, or that democracy was a good thing because it had history on its side. Sun Yat-sen in China in the 1920s talked like this before the real disasters of the 20th century disproved it. Or there was the dogma that democracy was the best form of government because it protected a set of earthly first principles: private property, above all, political order, and the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That was Jeremy Bentham's utility principle. All these old arguments are, I think, nonsense on stilts from yesteryear, which brings me to a third shock. Democracy, understood in our time as monetary democracy, as I call it, monitory, not monetary, monitory, as more than periodic fair, free, clean elections, but a permanent humbling of power, the attempt to keep power wherever it's exercised on its toes, requires new imagination and desperately fresh thinking. But the sad reality is that democracy today has become a mantra. Everybody should be in favour of it because everybody in their right and reasonable mind is in favour of democracy. That's the way Amartya Sen likes to argue. Or its fortunes are hitched to what the philosophers call consequentialist arguments. In plain English, democracy is good for everyone because it produces desirable effects, like economic growth. Singapore and China disprove that, and there are ecological doubts against that argument. Or its claim that democracy promotes peace. Ah, yes, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, as before in Vietnam and Cambodia, Korea and firebombed, radiated Japan. Or it's said that democracy is a universal ideal because it guarantees human rights that are said to be universal, which is, as my students would say, a tautology. It simply starts out with a premise that it concludes with. So 3 shocks in a row. Democracy, a precious old ideal that was until very recently universally condemned as dangerous. An ideal that has miraculously won over many millions of hearts and minds in all 4 corners of the earth, but an ideal that today, in my view, appears intellectually weak, dependent upon bogus reasoning and plain dogma. These weaknesses are grist to the mill of today's skeptics or outright anti-democrats, of whom there are rising numbers, not just on this podium, to my right, but in Moscow and Tehran, Beijing and Caracas. But take a deep breath, because here comes shock number 4. Gradually, everywhere, because of the rotten and terrible things that have happened in our lifetime, aerial bombardment, mustard gas, genocide, concentration camps, total war, a brand new argument for democracy has surfaced. A new justification that I wish to submit shows that democracy is for everyone, as relevant in the workplace, the home and your local community, as it is in general elections, on battlefields, in cross-border organisations like the UN, the Copenhagen process, the WTO, and as relevant in Rangoon and Washington as it is in Sydney and Tehran. I call this new argument for democracy, forgive the highfalutin word, the hubris argument. Hubris, bullshit, arrogance, and the blindness and stupidity that follow. Democracy, I submit, is good for everyone because it both recognises that some humans are arrogant, blind, foolish, power-hungry, enough to commit devilish acts, yet good enough to correct their own arrogance, blindness, folly, and hubris. The problem of hubris is, for me, the greatest ultimate challenge that this side of the debate has to face, that any system of concentrated and uncontested power has to answer for. 4 decades ago, the American psychologist, you may not know him, Irving Janis, labelled hubris a type of behaviour fed by groupthink. I like that. He showed how groupthink played a fundamental role in shaping the fiasco of the American invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. But we have more recent examples of what happens when concentrated power, reigns unchecked, actually brings about disastrous effects. Think for a second or two of the 17th floor of Manhattan's lipstick building, so-called, the no-entry floor where Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities operated a $65 billion rip-off Ponzi scheme. Ponder the harassment, currently arrest and disappearance of supporters of Charter 08 in China. Think of the verbal torture of the show trials unfolding in Tehran, in which, incidentally, I've been named as a CIA MI6 agent. Closer to home, think of the massive damage done to people and biosphere of the Great Western Desert by British atomic testing in the 50s. Think of the stolen generation of young indigenous people. Think of the Howard's government decision to invade Iraq with little or no cabinet discussion. What's common to all of these is hubris. Hubris is no laughing matter. It damages people's lives, and its global footprint is widening. Hubris, I think, drives home the painful truth of the old proverb that fools never differ, that unchallenged power is dangerous, ultimately because it is blind to the great complexity of our universe, the kind of world that Reverend Hitchens described last night, a world of contingency, of great unknowns and great unintended consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case and suggest to you that the key argument for democracy is it's the best weapon we have against hubris. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Keane. And now Ambassador Badra Kumar, a columnist and retired senior Indian diplomat. Ambassador.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it may come as a surprise that in our bleak world, 2/3 of all countries today are democracies. By that we mean that they have governments that have been formed through elections in which adult citizens could participate. Indeed, even authoritarian rulers go to great length to conduct national elections to affirm the legitimacy of their system. 3 cheers for democracy. Mankind does live in a democratic age. The thesis, democracy is not for everyone, may therefore appear redundant. The issue, in my opinion, is different. It concerns the so-called liberal democracy, which is broadly defined as a political system characterized by not only free and fair elections, but also by the rule of law, a separation of powers, and the protection of basic liberties of speech, assembly, religion, and property. Now we straightaway get into difficulties. The amorphous bundle of freedoms that are listed above and democracy do not go together always, including in the West, where democracy was born. After all, since 9/11, great restrictions have been put on liberties in almost all democracies. We see a paradox. Democracy is flourishing, but not liberty. Then there are other paradoxes. Suppose free and fair elections are held in Saudi Arabia and Osama bin Laden gets elected. That poses a dilemma. What if bin Laden leads Saudi Arabia toward an Islamic theocracy? It is virtually certain that if free and fair elections are held in secular Egypt, that may pave the way for the ascendancy of the Muslim Brotherhood. We are barely coping with the Hamas government, which is immensely popular, enjoys a political base that could be the envy of any political party in any functioning democracy today, and which has been elected to power in a free and fair election. China poses a different paradox. There is no parallel in human history where some 400 million people breach the poverty line within a generation and walk into a better life. Yet, China has no use for liberal democracy, and in fact it avows that it can do without liberal democracy. That brings us to another aspect. There is also a cultural dimension. It seems to me that any country aspiring to be a liberal democracy must also relocate to the West. Certainly, it has been a political advantage for the flourishing liberal democracies of the contemporary world to be part of the West. In the 50s and 60s, we cannot even recollect, there were popular leaders in Ghana, Tanzania, and Kenya who held elections and who were utterly committed Democrats. But they suffered a relapse and became petty dictatorships. In comparison, this didn't happen to Portugal or Spain. On the other hand, East Asia has a different story to tell, where in a nutshell, liberalizing autocracies laid the groundwork for stable democracies. The dictatorships opened the economy slowly and steadily to the market, and this process made the government more and more liberal. South Korea or Taiwan offer a curious mixture of liberalism, crony capitalism, democracy, and oligarchy. But they became considerably more liberal and democratic over the years. Of course, they have only reached the standards where most Western democracies stood a quarter century ago. But that itself speaks a lot. Compared to the East Asian success story, most developing countries which took to democracy with zest immediately after their independence, despite being poor and unstable, became dictatorships within a decade. Why did this happen? It is possible to argue that a new democracy's political success is critically dependent on its economic success. Alas, democracy seemed to die when countries took to it at low levels of development. But can we mark the level of development at which transition to democracy has good prospects of succeeding in Singapore or Russia? There are no easy answers as to what makes democracy endure. It seems to me that while political changes may ensue from a variety of factors, when an autocratic regime is replaced by democracy and the latter lasts, a correlation is possible to be established with wealth. The linkage is understandable. Firstly, wealth strengthens private business and the bourgeoisie, and these segments of society, which are critical to liberal democracy, begin to bargain sooner or later with the state on responsive governance, rule of law, etc. In other words, they act as catalysts of liberalization. The more rapid the growth, the more becomes the urge and necessity to liberalize, leading to increased literacy, intensification of mass communications, rising per capita income, growing urbanization, emergence of a professional middle class, and inevitably a business entrepreneurial class. A byproduct of economic liberalization is the emergence of civil society. Growth and modernity, in other words, unleash democratic forces. Here we come to the need for stability. Growth is not sustainable without stability and security. The point at which the authoritarian state opts to relax its grip or engenders a pluralistic infrastructure will always remain a delicate one. Accumulated discontents can erupt like volcanic lava. The Central Asian countries were fully justified in rejecting any forced march to democracy, which the West dictated in the decade and a half since the Soviet Union disintegrated. Clearly, the legacy of the color revolution in the three former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan, where it succeeded, looks dismal today. The continued validity of the democratization process in these countries appears questionable. Again, Afghanistan is a glaring example of the naivety with which the international community ventured into introducing democracy. The Afghan constitution is a brilliant document that was drawn up by American experts in 2003, but it completely overlooked the country's social formation, history, traditions, and culture. It accounts partly for the horrible misunderstanding that eventually ensued between Hamid Karzai and the United States. The buzzword today is Afghanization, the success of which depends on the realization that any enduring Afghan settlement will have to be intra-Afghan and inclusive, and should include especially the range of non-democratic forces such as the Taliban, the warlords, the Mujahideen, tribal maliks, the mullahs, and so on. To conclude, democratization seems inevitable. The information revolution, the internet, is breaking down hierarchies, empowering individuals, transforming societies, making central control difficult and dissent easy. Technology and information have been democratized, and in turn they are widening and deepening democratization. However, democracy has to come in good time. It is when a country modernizes its economy, takes to capitalism, and creates a bourgeoisie that the political system will begin to reflect that transformation and the country becomes ripe for democracy. Again, economic development and middle class are keys to sustaining democracy. The prerequisite of growth and development, on the other hand, is political stability. Finally, there is a cultural dimension insofar as different societies demand different frameworks of government. There can be liberal and illiberal democracy. What is needed is a variegated conception of liberal democracy. Genuine democracy is like a majestic clockwork, hard to perfect, leave alone suitable for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Badra Kumar. And now speaking against the motion, former Philippine Cabinet Minister Amina Rasul.
Thank you, Simon, for inviting me to this most impressive and scary forum. When I was listening to our distinguished opponents talk about why democracy is not for everyone but should be, I could not help but relate to who I am. I am a Muslim from Mindanao. I grew up in a small island which is now better known as a hotbed for terrorists called the Abu Sayyaf. I am a member of nobility. I actually had 2 grand-aunts married to 2 sultans. So I should be very happy with a different form of government. However, I did have my childhood under a democracy and saw how our people flourished under a democracy. I was a teenager when martial law came and took democracy away, and I saw how oppressive that was for all peoples, especially for Muslim minorities. And then I witnessed the coming back of democracy when President Aquino supported people power. And I saw how we flourished all over again under a democratic form of government. Now we have a problem with our democratically, well, that's what they say, democratically elected President, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. But let me say that the forces of democratization are still very strong in my country, and if there were problems in the election of 2007, then remedies are going to be developed and ensure that the succeeding elections are going to be free and fair. So when they say that democracy is not for everyone, I'm wondering who is the everyone that they're referring to. Could it possibly be me, this Muslim woman from a small island, conflict-affected, the subject of the war on terror? And since I and the rest of the people on my island believe that democracy is the only form of government that will allow us to survive, if not prosper, then I'm wondering who else democracy is not good for. When people say democracy is not for everyone, they usually think of communism and Islam and the Muslim states. Let me point out that the People's Republic of China, which celebrated 60 years of communism a few days ago, has been slowly adopting reforms and more democratic ways, especially in trade and finance. A friend of mine asked a Chinese official if they were embracing democracy, and the official serenely said, Chinese style. I also wonder what that means. Now, I read last week that the advances in education and health for the vast population of China actually happened during the first decade of the reforms under Prime Minister Deng Xiaoping. Let me now focus on Islam and the Muslim states, since many do believe that Islam is not compatible with democracy. What are the pillars of democracy? Sovereignty of the people, and therefore a government based upon consent of the governed and majority rule, free and fair elections, justice and the guarantee of basic human rights, including the rights of women and minorities, due process of law, and equality before the law. In Islam, we do find these pillars of democracy. Although we believe that sovereignty resides in God alone, we are the vicegerents or the stewards of God in this earth. In Surah 230 of the Quran, God informed his angels that he would appoint man as vicegerent on the earth to assume responsibility of knowledge, option, and commandment, and carry out his mission of populating and civilizing the earth. And therefore, mankind, we implement sovereignty for God. With regards to free and fair election, we have the principle of shura, or consultation, where the people are consulted on whom we believe should lead us. If shura has been manipulated by leaders to support authoritarian rule, this does not take away from the principle or doctrine of shura. In the same vein, the fraudulent manipulation of the electoral process by Catholic political leaders in the Philippines does not take away from the principle of free and fair elections as a pillar of democracy desired by people. Shura and ijma, or consensus, support government by the people, of the people, and for the people. Shura and ijma allow stakeholders like me to be part of the decision-making process. What other pillars of democracy are there? Apart from shura and ijma, we have adl, or justice, al-hurriya, or freedom, al-hukuk al-sharia, or legitimate rights. If we define democracy as liberal democracy with human rights and freedom, then we can point to Islamic countries that uphold liberal rights like Indonesia and Turkey. Now, if we look at women's participation as an indicator of women's rights and therefore as an indication of democratization, Turkey, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Pakistan have elected women heads of states. In the Philippines, Muslim provinces have elected women governors, the equivalent of your premiers, members of Congress, one senator, dozens of mayors, vice mayors, among others. Has Australia ever elected a woman prime minister? I recall how happy you were in 2007 when Julia Gillard made history as she became Australia's first female acting prime minister. In the US, people used to say that a black man had a better chance than a woman of being elected president, and they were right. President Barack Obama's election was watched on television by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Hillary Clinton, his presidential contender, she's Secretary of State appointed. There are 800 million Muslims who live in democratic states. Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country with some 200 million Muslims, is a democracy and grappling with issues of governance, corruption, human rights, just like any other democratic state. And yet, 20 years ago, the world despaired over the corrupt authoritarian government of Indonesia, assuming that this was normal, understandable, given that Indonesia was a Muslim majority country, pretty much like Iraq and Afghanistan. Look at Indonesia now. It is the strongest democracy in ASEAN, working on its own internal problems in as democratic a fashion as you do here in Australia. Malaysia, Bangladesh, Turkey are also democracies working on their own internal problems. It is true that in Afghanistan and Iran, the presidential elections have been contested. Does this automatically mean the Afghans and Iranians cannot be democratic? Well, the 2000 Philippine presidential elections were contested. Today, more and more Filipinos believe that Mrs. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo stole the elections. Does this mean the Filipinos cannot be democratic? Or can we infer that these democracies are young and have transition problems? Ladies and gentlemen, just because you are in transition and have to grapple with very serious issues of strengthening democratization, of protecting human rights, of having freedom of the press, and having strong civil society, it does not mean that democracy is not for you. It only means that we have to work harder at making sure that the democratic processes that we want will indeed govern us. As they say, vigilance is the price of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina Razul. And now speaking for the motion, Professor Greg Craven, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University.
Ladies and gentlemen, the good news tonight is that I am male, middle-aged, Victorian, a lawyer and the Vice-Chancellor of a Catholic university. I am objectively right about everything. And along those lines, may I say as a Victorian what great pleasure it gives me to speak to you tonight here in probably the most overhyped building in the universe. At least since Nebuchadnezzar built the lavatory block in the gardens of Babylon. Now, I am here tonight with the simple theme of a simple man faced by a very, very simple opposition. And that is that, like Malcolm Turnbull, democracy is not all it's cracked up to be and never was. And I was very glad that my preceding speaker introduced God into this debate because, as a Catholic, God belongs to me. With apologies to Kevin Rudd. And I think God's important here because, you see, if you look at the Bible, God's on our side. Have you ever read the Old Testament? There's not a lot of democracy. Not a lot of consultation and participation, but a lot of slewing and smiting and biting. And that's not surprising because, quite frankly, I don't think God could have got the numbers for her program. Humanity destroying floods, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Parramatta perhaps, but not Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, all in all, if you look at the Old Testament, it really does seem to roll out according to a strategic plan by Fred Nile, with special effects by Mel Gibson, but not a lot of Clover Moore. And I suggest to you, therefore, that it may well be that democracy is not God's plan. And there's further evidence to suggest that that is true. The great works of civilization, the pyramids, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Colosseum, the Victorian freeway system under the Kennett government, all given by brutal dictatorships. Whereas democracy has given us McDonald's baseball caps round the wrong way and Bronwyn Bishop. Now, can this really surprise us when we look at the history of Western democracy? Frankly, I speak for Carmen Lawrence here, a grossly overrated concept. After all, the average Western democratic politician, by definition, is a serial megalomaniac with one hand on the crotch of the electorate while the other picks its pocket. And I know that's right because I took it from the application form for the New South Wales right. Look at the examples of their leaders. United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, known to history as Attila the Hen. John Major, known to history as the man who came after Margaret Thatcher. Tony Blair, the man who had so much spin he vanished up his own axis, and that is just as painful as it sounds. And in the United States, Ronald Reagan, the man who saved the world by sleeping through the Cold War. George Bush, a man so inarticulate he makes Barry O'Farrell sound like Cameron Daddo. And Barack Obama, the hope of the Western world, although we know it will all end up in deflation, disappointment and recrimination, like a two-night stand with an inflatable doll. And so I think the thesis that we put forward tonight really is, and I put it as a thesis because that's a lawyer's word for something that will cost you a lot of money and probably isn't true, that democracy performs even in the glorious West with all the aptness of a chainsaw juggler at a children's birthday party. And one only has to look at Australia to see how very well it works. The great Australian Democratic Constitution, sometimes said the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights was drafted by angels. If so, the Australian Constitution was drafted by wombats. And wombats with degrees in chartered accountancy. This is the dullest constitution in the world, duller than a speech on democracy by Muammar Gaddafi. Its chief democratic feature, Australian federalism, in which you have a Senate with equal representation of the population of New South Wales and Tasmania, which recent scientific tests have shown to consist of one man called Ken living in a burrow outside of Launceston, his 9 wives and 9 sisters who are the same people. The Australian Constitution is to democracy what Kyle Sandilands is to wit. Populated by parties who provide the great service to Australian democracy of eliminating all danger of the electorate making a bad decision by ensuring that the opposition is always just as bad as the government. Now, even with parties as bad as that, of course, I do admit some people, and I say this out of deference to Dr. Lawrence, can be a little harsh to parties. For example, I recently heard a comparison of the New South Wales Reece government to the collapse of ancient Rome under the Emperor Caligula. I consider that unjust to His Imperial Majesty. After all, Caligula only made his horse Inciatus consul. In Sydney, he would have the numbers for Premier. And that, of course, brings us to the true horror of the whole system of democracy, politicians. The question is sometimes asked, the proposition is put, if you pay peanuts, you'll get monkeys. What I would like to know is, what are we paying to get scorpions with personality disorders? Although that may be unfair. To have a personality disorder, you must first have a personality. The average Australian politician, other than Dr. Lawrence, of course, has the personality of an electrical appliance. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you lifted up Wayne Swan's glasses? I swear that behind them you would find a spinning apparatus, 3 pairs of damp socks and a pair of sensible underpants. All occurring, of course, in that great constitution phenomenon known as Parliament. Parliament, of course, is called the great organ of democracy, though none of the organs that bear comparison can be mentioned upon television tonight. Do you ever wonder what happens at that great institution of Australian democracy when school children are dragged unwilling to witness question time? Is it perhaps like those terrified 8-year-olds who used to be taken in the 70s by their hippie parents to watch horses mate on the basis that it's beautiful? Mummy, Mummy, please make them stop. How in the name of God do you explain Bill Heffernan to a primary school child? And isn't it a bit too early to introduce them to that dimension of terror? And of course, the truly horrifying prospect that is occasionally seen, the ghastly sight of parliamentarians actually thinking that they are funny. And so we watch them deploying their lumbering wit like some cut-price Oscar Wilde on Valium with comic direction by Kerry Ann Kennelly. Ladies and gentlemen, we have put a moderate case tonight, I think. A case backed upon fact and evidence, and fully subscribed. I may have gone a little further than my colleagues. I sense their support as I speak to you. And I'm sure they will fess up to it in due course. Democracy, frankly, is not for everyone because it's not for anyone because the bastards won't give it to us.
Thank you, Professor Craven. And now for our final speaker, speaking against the motion, Dr. Michael Wesley, the Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you tear your little slips of paper, as Geraldine instructed you to do, please have some sympathy for our poor, deluded opponents today, because, quite frankly, they came along under the illusion that we were talking about democracy as a process. And I'm afraid we're not, because democracy is for everyone. And I'm not talking about democracy as a process in which, you vote and you do all of these other little things and have all of these parliamentary procedures. Democracy is for everyone because democracy is a consciousness, and democracy as a consciousness is advancing to all corners of the world, whether or not the people with that consciousness live under governments such as ours, for better or worse. So to argue that democracy is not for everyone is a bit like the guy who I think worked for IBM in the 1950s, who said we shouldn't be making these things anymore because only a handful of people in the future will use them. Democracy as a consciousness, democratic consciousness, is driven by the forces of globalisation and in particular by the communications revolution. We now live in a world in which nobody, not even Kim Jong-il, dares to be against democracy. Awareness of what democracy is and the values of democracy is being carried to all people and all corners of the world simply by the communications revolution. It is there, it is advancing fast. People who have access to the wonders of the communication revolution now are experiencing free speech for the first time ever. And it doesn't matter what sort of regime they live under. They are refusing to accept the packaged truths that are served up to them by state-run media or News Corporation. They are using their mobile phones to take pictures of things. They are using Twitter to organise demonstrations against elections gone bad. They are very aware of their freedom to speak and the importance of getting information from people who don't have an interest in packaging it a particular way. More and more people around the world, the bottom billions, have a growing awareness of inequality, of poverty, of unequal access to certain types of lifestyles and certain types of rights. They are aware that when we refuse to act in the wealthy West, our inaction is in effect an action towards them. More and more people in this age of globalisation, with this globalised consciousness of democracy, are experiencing a world in which their votes actually count. I'm not talking about stolen Afghan elections or stolen Iranian elections. I'm talking about reality TV shows in which you can text in and have people thrown off the set, in which you can text in and say who you think won the debate, in which you can tear your little slip of paper and describe my side of the argument to have won tonight. What I'm talking about, I guess, if you want to encapsulate the growing importance of democracy as a consciousness is the death of fatalism. Globalisation is killing fatalism. It is killing the simple acceptance of people that they live as they do because that's how they were born. They do not accept that anymore. And the fact that they are demonstrating on the streets of Tehran saying, "Where's my vote?" The fact that they are staging demonstrations, some 90,000 a year in China, against poor governance and corruption, shows that fatalism is dead. Democracy is here as a consciousness. However, what we have to accept is that democracy as we live it, and as we have thought of as being the only form of government, the only legitimate form of government, is how we do it here in Australia and in like-minded countries. That era is dying. We are at the cusp of an era of the growing diversity of conceptions of democracy. There are going to be different types of democracy in the future. We are leaving the era in which one model of democracy is held up as the standard to which all societies must subscribe and aspire to. There is an increasing questioning of absolute standards of what a democracy means, i.e. the sort of government that we have here in Australia and in the West. Increasingly, I've noticed that young Chinese people are beginning to ask more and more tight and incisive questions about what it is that democracy means. They're starting to suggest, for example, that democracy might have more forms than we are prepared to admit. But are we then headed towards an Orwellian world in which anything can pass as democracy, in which a democratic People's Republic of Korea can pass for a democracy? No, we're not. Because we have to be very careful about, when we talk about democracy, being able to talk about a more diverse range of types of government, but not all types of government are, of course, democracies. So what is the test? The test is, I think, encapsulated in a question that before I stopped being an academic, I would ask my students when I talk to them about democracy. We'd be sitting there and we'd be talking about what democracy means, and I would say to them, if Kevin Rudd was to walk into the classroom today, would you fear him? And they kind of look at me and they say, no, why would we fear him? And I guess that test didn't work as well when Mark Latham was on the list to be Prime Minister. But no, they don't fear him. And the reason, ultimately, that we do not fear Kevin Rudd is because we can sack him. That is the ultimate test of a democracy. Can you sack the leader? This is important because being able to sack leaders brings new styles of leadership, brings an important style of leadership to countries. Because, as our opponents have all pointed out, yes, democratically elected leaders can make mistakes, and by God, they do make mistakes. But the important thing about being able to sack them is that their mistakes are self-correcting, because they want to stay in power. And let's face it, the advancing consciousness of democracy lets them know when they have made mistakes, and they do everything within their power to correct those mistakes. Now, the important point that I want to leave you with tonight, or this afternoon, is that we need this style of leadership around the world today. We need it at all levels of government. Why? Because with the global problems that we face, we can risk no other type of leadership. Think about probably the most pressing problem that we face, the problem of global warming. You can point out, and certainly we had extreme examples of this, particularly within the opposition this week, the failings of democratic leadership when we're trying to do something about globalisation, about global warming. But the problem is that without that global consciousness of democracy, without that responsiveness of leadership, we would not be anywhere near the progress that we're making on arresting global warming. If we were led by a group of world leaders who had no fear that they would be sacked or that they could be sacked, we would be pressing ahead with industrialisation, we would be denying climate change, we would be doing nothing about it. So I would leave you with the proposition that with the global problems that we face, we can risk no other type of leadership than democratic leadership. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wesley. Now, what we're going to do, we have a slight pause now, just while the lectern in the middle is going to be removed. And what I'd ask you to do, if you'd like to make a speech or for a minute for the motion or against the motion, or pose a question to any of our speakers, then if you're in the centre, if you could start just moving along, and you can see that there's 4 microphone spots, one just across there, one here, one just up at the back, and one down in the corner. And it's really important, if you'd like to, that you sort of take your position now so that we can get some speakers. This is your chance not to listen to what the speakers have said, but actually to go to it. And you can pick up on any of the topics that you like. You might want to talk about the quality of democracy in New South Wales, or you might want to go a bit more generally. As I say, it might be a question. What I'll do when we go back to it is I'll just start going, and I'll take a few from each microphone. I'll move around. There'll be an opportunity there to have your say. Okay, just ask people. Thank you. Well, we've heard from the speakers, and now it's time for the audience. But before we hear from the audience, I'd like to present you with the result of the pre-debate to poll. In relation to the motion that democracy is not for everyone, the pre-debate poll was for 54%, against 26%, don't know 20%. Now, what we'll be able to see as this conversation unfolds is whether or not the combination of what has been said by our speakers and from the floor changes that result when we have the final decisive ballot towards the end. Let's start off with microphone over here, gentleman in the purple shirt.
Thank you, Richard Vickery. It seems clear that democracy can be a dangerous idea. In the hands of well-educated, rational, thoughtful, respectful people, it can do great things. But in the hands of ill-educated, irrational, bigoted people, it can bring about lynching mobs and massacres. It seems incumbent on us then to do our best to train the next generation so that they'll be able to act in a way that will bring out the best in us and in democracy. And to do this, we need to train them in how to think. That's what I believe, by teaching them philosophy and ethics. In our state, every week 100,000 children sit twiddling their thumbs while their friends go and learn ethics and morals in scripture lessons, while those who opt out are not allowed to be taught anything. The Parents and Citizens Federation of New South Wales and the St James Ethics Centre have a proposal before the Minister that we should be allowed to teach ethics and philosophy to those children who have no religious beliefs or whose religious beliefs are not catered for. This proposal has been knocked back twice. A new proposal sits on the Minister's desk, and I'd urge all of you here today to sign the petition and lobby the Minister to have this very important defence of our democracy put through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lower microphone. Sir.
Ian McGregor, I'd like to strongly agree with Carmen Lawrence that democracy is not for everyone. In fact, in modern Western countries, democracy is for corporations. Corporations control the lobbying, the political donations, and result in the continued destruction of the environment by modern corporations. That results in the CPRS representing the continuing pollution regardless scheme rather than real efforts to address global warming.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple more, then I'll throw to the panel. Yes, up in the back.
My name's Jan Turnbull, and I'd support the motion that democracy is not for everyone because there's a better way to govern society, and a way which doesn't mean that the money power influences the decisions taken, supporting the previous speaker. We have plutocracy at the moment. The better way to govern is the Athenian way, in which there is a ballot to randomly select from pre-selected people who should have a turn at governance. And that way it doesn't pay anybody to bribe anybody, because you don't know who's going to be your ruler. So that's called demarchy. So I think there's a better way than democracy to govern society, and we need to push it down in the grassroots of our organisations in the public and private sector. And look up on Google my little public policy booklet published by the New Economics Foundation in London called A New Way to Govern Organisations to Society After Enron. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes. And fourth one up the back.
I would suggest that democracy is not for everyone, because its pleasures are so fleeting, like that of marital sex. When you think of how excited we were to democratically get rid of John Howard, and within moments I would like to challenge anyone to try and tell Kevin Rudd that he's wrong when his hair's slightly damp and he hasn't had a proper meal.
Okay, so we've got... Let's Carmen Lawrence, let's start with this notion of not having elections as such, but going back to the Athenian system in relation to just selecting from people in ballots. Have you got any view about that?
Look, I think it's time for some more experimentation. Australia in particular used to be called a laboratory for democracy, and we've been satisfied for too long, I think, with a degraded form of democracy. I did a tour before I left politics and went to Scotland and the Scandinavian countries, where they were very concerned that the participation of their people had dropped off. That's not a concern that you hear expressed in Australia very often, because the political elites quite like it that way. So I think it's important for people to think about alternative ways of getting involved in politics. Participation and involvement, especially if it's extensive, will, I think, renew our democracy. Leaving it to the hands of a privileged few is simply not acceptable.
John Keane?
Well, I mean, for those don't knows and those who remain for, I mean, it was really a pushover from our side. We had a melancholic democracy is inevitable, Mr. Bhadrakumar. We had a despondent, Carmen Lawrence, complaining about the unfulfilled ideals of democracy. That's when democracies are at their healthiest and most energetic, by the way. And a stand-up comedian who, true to his surname, Craven, thinks that government, self-government, could be through laughter. Come on. I looked at the list of good things about authoritarian, non-democratic rule, unlimited economic growth, build highway systems, Victorian style, prevents wombat constitutions, and Tasmanian incest. I mean, what a load of nonsense. I do think that Carmen Lawrence is our real friend here, because rightly she is highlighting the grumbling, the belly-aching that's widespread in actually existing democracies against party systems and parliaments and whole governments. And she is right also to see, rather analogous to the end of the 19th century, this is serious stuff, in the United States and the early 20th century, it is possible for democracies to democratize themselves, to invent new ways of handling power. And I can think of a list for this country that includes a republic, that includes dealing with the poisonous effects of money, that deals with this unsolved problem of coming to terms with the peoples whose lives we ruined, and finding a new geopolitical framework for our democracy in the Asia and Pacific region. I mean, all this is on the agenda. I think all of this is being discussed, and it will be discussed, and it shows that actually democracies enable the overcoming of hubris, of arrogance, of stupidity, of mistakes, and actually pushing through to something new.
Okay.
As for government by laughter, well, I have my own stock too, but I think we probably should be serious from here on.
Okay, we'll come back. I might give Greg Craven in a little while an opportunity for reply to that assault on him and his wombats. But before we do, just down here in this section, in the green shirt.
You mentioned that democracy was the best hope we had to fix the environmental problems of the world. To fix the environmental problems of the world, we probably need to face up to some truths that most people don't want to deal with. surely democracy is the worst possible way to try and deal with that, because all they're going to do is tell people what they want to hear. That's how democracy works.
Okay, up the back. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
Andrea Henwood. Some years ago, during an American election that resulted in George Bush being elected, my mother stamped her foot on the floor and said, "Why can't I vote in this election? It's far too important a decision to leave to the Americans." It strikes me that I'd like to make a comment in favour of the motion that democracy is not for everyone, because I think democracy in its current format is anachronistic. The really important issues for the planet cannot be dealt with by narrow sovereign interests, usually. They get held up because we're not making decisions for the common good. They also get held up on the time frame within which political parties usually operate, which is very short term, when we need to have a very long term perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to the back.
Hi there, Donnie McClurkin. How does a democracy serve a life prisoner in a country in which that person isn't entitled to vote?
Okay, that's a question. And down to this microphone.
Hi, Rob Grosham. I'm basically saying democracy is not for everyone, with a proviso under the current methods. Democracy has got some very serious flaws. If we, for instance, look at East Timor, there's a very good example of what happens when the majority rules. You had two tribal factions that were at war with each other. The majority won. And now you have a democracy stacked with the winning party to the detriment of the minor part of the population. So democracy inherently has got the problem that the majority is just not always right. Mm-hmm. That is one issue. The other issue with democracy is that the power that drives democracy is consumption and taxes. One of the major flaws we have in our democratic system in Australia is that the taxes flow to the federal government. Now, if you look at history, the occurrences of the last century, the major wars, for instance, and dictatorships, mostly occurred because taxation went straight from the common person to the federal arena. Therefore, you have a huge amassment of power that can be unduly used.
Okay, so it's a point about tax and it's I'll leave it at that.
The point basically is this, you see. Democracy is driven by taxes and the access to taxes. If you, for instance, look at Australian democracy in the
I have to ask you, I have to come to just to finish there, taxes thing. Michael Wesley, there's a killer point made to you really, and that was that you've raised the issue of climate change and you are actually thinking that the solution is in the hands of democracy. And I think a lot of people would say there's no way they're going to be able to get their act together to fix this.
Well, I think they're better able to get their act together than other types of government. I mean, I'm quite gobsmacked by the level of cynicism in this room, particularly given that we're all living in a democracy. I wonder whether we'd all be as cynical if we were living in North Korea about democracy. On the question of democracy and environmental problems, I'll just put a simple point back to the person who asked that question and those that clapped. Which type of countries have the better environmental records? Democracies or non-democracies? Let me put in front of you the democratic world against the Soviet Unions and the Chinas and the appalling environmental consequences of development and the human consequences of development in those places. So while democracies may be slow-moving, they are deliberate and they will take action on climate change. They are leading on climate change now. I see no leadership from the non-democratic world on climate change. I see reluctant followership. They are leading on climate change and they will get there. They will eventually get there. The sense that people vote out of self-interest in democracies is quite frankly wrong. It is based on outdated and very poor political science that comes out of the United States. People act according to their vision of the good, and it's not necessarily a self-interested vision of the good. The reason we have action on climate change is because we have a grassroots swell of concern about it. That's democracy, and it is democratic leaders that are first to listen. They may be inadequate first up to act, but as long as the grassroots swell of concern continues, they will start to take more and more action over it. And you just watch this space.
Okay. We'll go back to the room. We'll start down here now. Yes?
Hi, my name's Andrew Smolsky, and I was proffering a kind of a question. I had noticed that the parameters of the debate had been set in indirect democracies and republics, the parliamentary system here or the system in my country, the United States. And I was wondering, what would y'all think about direct democracy, where the participation is at the local level and rises in a networked form instead of being done through the state or through corporations, rather being actually on the people level and allowing the people to debate the issues and legislate for themselves and delineate the tasks themselves without a coercive institution. Thank you.
Okay. Might get a bit more of this. Is the idea that the people vote directly, using technology, make their decisions from the ground up. Yes.
Ben Teal, my sympathies go out to the affirmative. It must sting that your success or failure in this debate will be decided by democratic vote. However, some of your comments do have merit, unfortunately, to the wrong question. They have merit if the question being asked is whether democracy is not for everyone right now. You've provided examples of failings of particular states, classes of society, or individuals in them. I will throw you I'll be a little sympathetic to your side. I will give you this vote if you can name for me a country or a geographic region, a cultural, a tribal or some sort of ethnic group, a city-state, or hell, even a class in a society where democracy is not for them, but, not right now, but never will be for them. I throw this to the affirmative. Name me one of those, and you will have this vote.
Okay. It's a direct challenge to the affirmative. Can you name one society, one state, one organisation that will never get democracy and should not? I think that's the question. Yes. Anyway, Greg Craven, can you think of one?
Well, I
the Vatican?
Sorry.
I may have got you one vote, that's all.
I won't hazard a guess at New South Wales. That would be unfair. I think, frankly, you can respond to that kindly or unkindly. The kind version is that's a very, very silly question. The real issue is how many places can you look at now and say they've never, ever had democracy and there's no sign of it coming round the corner. Because you can't prove a negative, but you can use your own eyes.
Yep. Please applaud him, if you'd like to. Amina, do you want to respond to this, or is it John? John, you do. Oh, go for it, John.
Well, let me start first. I really cannot imagine any state now that has never been, that's not a democracy and is not moving towards it. I mean, if you're looking at the monarchies in the Arab world, over the past 5 years, they have been moving, although very slowly, I may add, but they have been moving towards a more democratic frame for government. Saudi Arabia very recently had a deputy minister who is female, finally appointed. In Kuwait, they have elected women to parliament. So the move is towards more democratic forms of government. And it seems to me like we are all hung up here on the problems of democratization. And isn't that precisely why it is so good to belong to a form of government called democracy? Because it allows you to rectify, it allows you corrective mechanisms so that you can attain the ideals of a democratic state. If I were in an authoritarian regime, as we were during the martial law days, this gathering would not be possible. I cannot possibly be speaking here, and there would be no chance of reforms being implemented.
John, do you want to make a brief comment? No.
Three very quick points to our opponents. First, there is a clever argument that democracies require institutions that should not be elected and democratically accountable, like, imagine an air traffic control system that was subject to periodic elections, or imagine an election commission. India is a very good case in point where a professional, unelected body becomes a precondition of the sharing of power of democracy. Second, I haven't heard, even from Greg Craven, the alternative. I mean, look what's on the table if you don't like democracy. Petro-tyrants, narcissistic, young girl-loving sultans like Berlusconi, bullies. That, I don't get into Italy after that. Army generals. I mean, it's a serious question. And are you thinking about good kings and queens? Or are you thinking about tyrants or what? Third, to Mr. Badrakumar, I am really surprised that you didn't discuss India, and you spoke as if you'd moved already to the West. I mean, India changed everything in the history of democracy. It, against all odds, in a society of heartbreaking poverty, of almost overwhelming illiteracy, with a very poor economic infrastructure, it decided, Congress Party, to develop through democracy and to prove that actually multi-faith, multicultural societies where there was never a democratic tradition are actually require democracy in order to hold together without civil war and without dictatorship. I mean, that is an achievement. And if it can happen in India, it can happen anywhere.
Ambassador Badrakumar. Ambassador Badrakumar.
I began to suspect that things would come to this, because, we too say in India that, ours is the biggest democracy in the world. But, when you get closer to the reality, you see the aberrations, like Mr. Keane had mentioned about the conduct of elections. The kind of aberrations which have crept in today, the role money plays in that. The question of identity of an Indian. Amartya Sen has written about this multiple identities of Indians. He relates in terms of his caste, his religion, his region, his ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So, the essence of, the quintessence of democracy, that is what we are finally coming to. We need to adapt. And in India, I think we have managed it only because of this magic that we have is that we simply stopped caring what others thought of the norms and standards with which we practice democracy in India. Because otherwise aberrations are tremendous aberrations. And if you look back at the last 10 to 15 years, you find degradation of state institutions, including press. India is not alone. I saw on the television today that there's a march in the center of Rome, where some 74% people think that Berlusconi is having a crusade against free press. This sort of thing is happening in other places also. But in India, it's very, very important because we started on a weak wicket. Now, it has been mentioned that it was it is a very risky endeavor. But you must also remember that India's independence was essentially a middle-class enterprise, an enterprise by the bourgeoisie. And the value systems were imbibed by them through their Western education, English education, and mostly in Britain. So, you see, India had a few advantages, but there are a lot of aberrations came in between. And we really don't know whether that kind of democracy as we are practicing in India is a kind of democracy that we can prescribe to any other country. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to be squeezed for time, so what I'm going to try and do is to try and get around a number of people who've been waiting to speak. I'd ask you to really focus your remarks into just 15 to 30 seconds. The panel, rather than coming back to you, make a note of it and try and capture it in the sum-up. So we're going to go along. I'll get as many as I can. If I don't get everybody, please apologise. I apologise for that. So just here first, just really pithy.
Peter Hindrup. Meanwhile, China thunders ahead, cleaning up, installing the latest of an equipment in pollution control, is well up, if not in advance, in electric vehicle manufacture. But that's a side issue. In the US, UK and Australia, the majority of the population was against invasion of Iraq. Democracies. We invaded anyway. One of the very few free and fair elections in recent times was of the Hamas government. What did the other democracies do? Labelled them terrorists and stopped the flow of money going into them.
Okay, thank you for that.
So much for freedom.
Okay, thank you. Down here in the lower part. Try and keep it really focused.
Yeah, it seems to me we haven't posed the question for which democracy is the proposed answer, and we haven't laid down the criterion for which to answer the question. The question here, seems to me, is how is power exercised? If we live in a community, we have communities need a government. Governments take tremendous power over citizens, and the question and the criterion for how that power should be taken is what gives any wielder of power legitimacy. Okay. And surely every citizen everywhere should reasonably ask, why should you exercise power over me?
Okay.
And democracy answers that question.
Thank you.
Than any other.
Why should you exercise power over me? Up the back.
I'd just like to say, when you talked about the Pope, he is elected by a college of cardinals, so it is a democracy. Okay. Afterwards, they say it's chosen by God.
No, you've just lost a vote. Up the back on the other side. Very brief.
Jenny Haddon. It would seem that democracy in the abstract is a great idea, but the execution of it seems to require an intellectual elitism and distrust of the poor or ill-educated. And there are just too many examples in the world today of what happens to countries when democracy is forced upon them by superpowers who say that they know what's best for them. I'd support the argument that democracy is not for everyone yet. It seems that the common theme for the panelists arguing against it is that democracy is good for people, but not for government or politicians. And my question is, do you have any solutions or follow-up statements that would back your statements?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take just two more. That's all there's time for. One from either side, starting here, and then we're going to move to the vote because we're going to be caught by time. Yes.
Hi, I'd just like to send a message to Kevin Rudd and alert him to the fact that he actually is elected now, and I think he could quite safely drop his Ruddbot Act and instead engage in conversation and debate with the Australian public, because when you have a situation where the media are as bad as they are in reporting what's going on in the government and elsewhere, then when you have a national leader who simply repeats the same thing, then you have a major problem for democracy.
Thank you. And sir, I'm afraid you'll be the last person. Thank you.
Okay, quick question. Robin Tedder, is compulsory voting democratic or undemocratic?
Okay. Well, somewhat ironically, we now move to the point where we vote on the motion. As you know, that the motion is that democracy is not for everyone. Now, voting's pretty straightforward. You will have been given the ticket. It's got two sides. There's a for side, against side. Make sure you've got your hand to it. If you're still undecided, and I hope you're not after the arguments you've heard, you'll put in the ticket still joined together. While you vote, each of our speakers will be summing up. You will already have heard their best arguments, I hope. They haven't held up for them. So ballot boxes are going to be passed along. If you could start voting now. The topic is that democracy is not for everyone. It's time for the closing statements now from the speakers. And Michael Wesley, we're going to go to you first. You have 2 minutes now to make some closing remarks. Please listen to him. Michael Wesley, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy here in Sydney.
I guess I would start with the question about the invasion of Iraq. And the question I would throw back is, are any of the leaders who were involved in the invasion of Iraq still in power? No, they are not. They all lost government. Two of them, their parties lost catastrophically. The other one, his party is going to lose catastrophically next year. that there is a very clear signal about democracy here. You do not go against the wishes of the majority and wish to maintain to stay in power. Will we see another war like Iraq where democratic countries go into an invasion against the wishes of the majority of the population within our lifetimes? I don't think so, because such a clear signal has been sent by the whole Iraq experience. What I would say is that the importance of democracy is not that democracy is a golden ideal or a golden standard, that it is always an unchanging. Democracy changes, and what I would predict is that in our lifetimes we will see democracy evolve as well. The democratic consciousness that I spoke about, the globalised democratic consciousness, is causing political change. It is causing political change in those kingdoms in the Middle East. It is causing political change in China and in other non-democratic parts of the world. And it will cause political change here. All of the signals, all of the cynicism that you are registering will eventually affect the way that our leaders govern, and we will look back on 2009 in 30 years' time and not be able to believe that our political system worked as it did today.
Thank you. Professor Greg Craven, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University.
Well, to be serious about it, I think that what we've actually got here is a relatively old-fashioned school kids definitional debate. It's a debate about whether democracy is for everyone, and one side saying, well, what that means is it really, really, really ought to be, and this side's just saying, well, as a matter of fact, rather than fantasy, it isn't. And that's the question that you have to decide. Are you dealing today with fantasy or fact? And when Carmen Lawrence said evidence, that's what she meant. And the evidence is that democracy is, if for anyone, for very, very few people indeed. Now, we're not saying that you have to have perfect democracy to qualify for the concept, but it does actually have to exist. And I don't think you can accept two of the sleights of hand that are going on here. One is the sort of postmodern idea of democracy. Well, if it's a little bit democratic, if it's flavoured with democracy, if it has a sticker saying not entirely democratic, then that's all right. No, it's not. There are keystones that you can go for. And the other is this idea that the world is surging towards this wave of inexorable democracy that will take us all with it. Well, you know, the immortal words of Napoleon, get a life. Have a look at history and have a look at that surge. Have a look at how many places have been democratic for how long, and have a look at how many democratic movements and countries have been snuffed out as they move to the nirvana that's being sold over there.
Thank you. Amina Azul, Director of the Philippine Council for Islam and Democracy.
We seem to think that democracy is like a party dress that anybody can put on, one size fits all. Democracy is like a dress that political parties and stakeholders and governments must continuously repair and adjust so that it fits the needs of society. Sometimes we gain weight. I don't want to admit it, but I do. Sometimes we lose weight, and so you must adjust the democratic processes to suit your needs. And my needs in the Philippines are different from the needs of newly democratizing states in the Middle East or the needs of the democracy that is known as Australia. At the end of the day, I must think, what is the alternative? Do you want a totalitarian regime? We've had that. It sucks. Do you want an authoritarian regime? Sucks too. Monarchy, I'm not so sure about that since I'm partly royal. It says it sucks. So at the end of the day, we really have to look at not the process, but what democracy offers all of us, and do we want it? Do we want personal liberties? Yes. Do we want our voice to make a difference in the decisions that affect our lives? Yes. Do we want justice? Yes. Do I, as a woman, want a chance to become head of state? Yes. Do Australian women think that someday you should be head of state? Yes. That can only happen in a democracy and not in any other system. So I must admit democracy is for everyone. We just have to make sure that we work on the process so it becomes a democracy that we need and that we want.
Thank you. Ambassador Badra Kumar, columnist, retired senior Indian diplomat.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have much to add to what I said, but, now that the voting has taken place, I can speak a little differently. I must completely agree with what Professor... with what Professor Wesley said, two things. One is it all boils down to the idea of democracy. Secondly, we cannot afford to be static. It is an evolving situation. I'll illustrate the point. I said that we are doing very well with liberal democracy because we jettisoned all the classical norms and standards of liberal democracy in India. Now, what we are venturing into, I'll simply illustrate this better, if I give a concrete example. What we are doing now is we are planning a legislation which is hugely controversial, which is to reserve 50% of seats in the Indian Parliament for women. Now, this is in the history of democracy. This has not been attempted in any other part of the world, and I can't see this being attempted considering the seriousness of male chauvinism. But in India this is very important, and even communist parties which are rooted in Marxian ideology, which don't see social political processes in this way, have come to the vanguard of this movement asking for this legislation. Why is this important? Because real India lives in villages. And if we really want to change the production relations in the villages and change the socio-economic conditions dramatically, the only way to do it is to really empower women. That is not by allowing her to go to the polling booth and vote once in 5 years, but only by putting her in the driving seat.
Thank you. John Keane, Professor of Government at the University of Westminster, and soon, I think, to return to Sydney.
The usual three things. Nobody dared name a place, a people, a context where it will never happen or will not happen in the foreseeable future. That's a very telling point, and I hope that many of you changed your minds after the precedent was set by our ticket-waving friend in the high ranks up there. Secondly, about fact or fantasy, I think actually there's a really serious point about a serious misunderstanding of democracy. I hope we go away with this thought in our heads that democracy is, by definition, not an achievable end. There is no end of democracy. That's to misunderstand the ideal. At every time and place in its history, people have been chasing it around corners, upstairs, into blue skies. The best formulation in a sentence is that by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who says, democracy is always the democracy to come. And I think that's absolutely right. And so the bellyaching, the dissatisfactions that have been put here in this very fine hall, I think are really symptomatic of the democratic spirit. Third, you're a very charming audience. I'm now going to say this after you've voted. I think engaged, witty, smart, above all ironic. And I think that irony and the theatre of politics that goes with irony, the sense, the ability to stand in other shoes and to take other sides, I mean, it's really a wonderful democratic sentiment, and I'm greatly buoyed by it. It reminds me of a similar sentiment in the joke that's told, and I'll stop with this, of two office employees in Athens, birthplace of democracy for some, on the eve of the Olympics in 2004, and they get into a discussion over coffee about the end of dictatorship. One says, it's great, we have no more dictatorship, we have democracy. The other says, ironically, democracy? What's that? I'll tell you what it's like, says the colleague. It's like this. You've had a hard day at the office, you leave, you're tired, you're standing in pouring rain waiting for a bus, and the boss pulls up in his BMW, winds down the window and says, would you like a ride? Sure, get in. Takes you back to his house. Would you like to dry off? Here, sit by the fire. Would you like a brandy? Perhaps stay for dinner? Would you like to stay for the evening? The other employee says, yeah, is this democracy? Yeah, he said, it's like that. He said, but did this ever happen to you? He said, no, but it happened to my sister.
Okay. And Professor Carmen Lawrence, the former Premier of Western Australia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so attentive. I'm not cynical, but I do want to live in a democracy that's worthy of the name. And as I said at the outset, I want to live with the evidence. It's not possible to improve a democracy unless you illustrate and understand the problems it confronts. It's not something that evolves automatically. It requires action. It requires people like yourselves and many others to actually roll up their sleeves and see the shortcomings in the democracies that we have. Failing to do that will mean that we have further slides into undemocratic practices. The question was asked, I think somewhat rhetorically, about whether there were places right now or whether we could imagine them in the future where democracy didn't prevail. Just look at the political parties in Australia. The two major political parties that run this country, that select candidates and outline policies for the election, neither of them is constructed on basic democratic principles. There's an answer to your question. We have a lot of problems in our democracies, and failure to confront them will only mean that they get worse, and we won't be able to deal with problems like climate change. I'm not a cynic, I'm an optimist. I think that human beings want to collaborate and want to be engaged. They want to break down some of these alliances that operate against the general interests, the moneyed interests. They want to participate in ways that mean that their views are not simply consulted in inverted commas and then ignored. What I'm arguing for is a new kind of democracy, a democracy of participation, of energetic citizenship. We, as I say, need to construct a democracy worthy of the name. It won't evolve by magic. It won't fall out of the sky. It won't be given as a gift to us. It's only the extent to which we're prepared to get involved, that we exercise vigilant democratic citizenship, that we will have a democracy in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm hoping that somewhere in the background now, yes, it's happened. Let me remind you, before I open this, which is the final result of the poll, of how the poll stood before the debate was conducted. Then the undecided vote was 20%, for was 54%, and against 26%. And now the final results. Don't know, undecided is 5%. For, 34%, and against 61%. Congratulations to the winners. Congratulations to the winners. Commiseration to the losers. I wonder if you'd join me now, please, in thanking this marvellous panel of speakers.
This is ABC Fora.